At 4:37 on the morning of March 15, 1945, Staff Sergeant William Colby crouched behind a shattered stone wall on the southern edge of Okinawa's Kakazu Ridge, watching 200 Japanese soldiers mass for a Banzai charge that would overrun his company's position in less than 2 minutes. The wall had been part of a tomb before American artillery reduced it to rubble 3 days earlier. Now it provided the only cover between Colby and the enemy trench line 380 yards to the north. Dawn mist hung over the sugarcane field between them, thick enough to obscure movement but thin enough to see shapes. Dark shapes. Hundreds of them. In Colby's hands was a contraption his own squad had been calling the sergeant's junkyard joke for 6 weeks. A wooden plank 4 feet long. A section of copper tubing 18 inches in length, mounted to the plank with salvaged hose clamps. A modified rifle trigger assembly bolted to the underside. The whole assembly weighed 11 pounds and looked like something a farm boy might build to shoot fence posts at crows. Colby was 29 years old. Enlisted 1942. Born in Decatur, Illinois. Worked as an auto mechanic before the war. His service record listed him as a qualified marksman and a chronic equipment modifier. Officers in his chain of command had used different words. Tinkerer. Garage hobbyist. Time waster. 6 weeks ago, when Colby unpacked the contraption from a wooden crate he had spent 3 nights building in a maintenance tent, Captain Raymond Morris told him it looked like something his nephew would build in shop class. Morris ordered Colby to stow it and carry regulation equipment. Colby carried it anyway. Now, at 4:37 in the morning, with Japanese voices rising in synchronized chants from the northern ridgeline and the sound of bayonets being fixed echoing across 380 yards of open ground, Captain Morris was 40 feet to Colby's left, crouched behind the same ruined wall, watching Colby load a Mark II fragmentation grenade into the copper tube. The grenade weighed 21 ounces. Colby had calculated the propellant charge to send it 350 to 400 yards depending on elevation angle. He had tested the launcher exactly once, in secret, at an abandoned rice paddy 4 miles from the front line. 1 test. 3 grenades. 1 hit. Colby adjusted the elevation. 22 degrees, calculated from trigonometry he had taught himself using a 1938 Popular Mechanics magazine he kept folded in his pack. The magazine was water-stained now, pages stuck together, but Colby had memorized the trajectory tables months ago. The Japanese chanting grew louder. Officers' voices cut through the sound, sharp commands in a language Colby did not understand but recognized as preparation. They were coming. The Banzai charge that intelligence had predicted for 3 days. The human wave assault that had broken American positions at i.e. Shima, at Kakazu West, at every ridge and village for the past 2 weeks. Colby pressed the wooden stock against his shoulder and placed his thumb on the trigger. Captain Morris's voice cut through the dawn. "Sergeant, what the hell is that thing?" Colby did not look away from his sight line. "Sir, respectfully watch." The Japanese line surged forward. 200 men. Fixed bayonets. Officers waving swords at the front. Colby squeezed the trigger. The launcher kicked against his shoulder with a dull thump. The grenade arced into the mist. And then we need to go back. Back 6 weeks to understand how a Depression-era mechanic with a welding torch and a physics textbook built the weapon that would change how the United States Army thought about improvised ordnance. Back to the mockery. Back to the moment when Colby's commanding officers told him to stop wasting time on toys and focus on being a real soldier. January 28, 1945. 6 weeks before the Banzai charge. Camp Tarawa, Hawaii. The 96th Infantry Division was preparing for the Okinawa invasion with the kind of intensity that came from watching other divisions bleed at Iwo Jima and knowing your turn was next. Staff Sergeant William Colby had arrived at Camp Tarawa in December of 1944 after spending 8 months fighting through the Philippines. Ormoc Valley. Places where Japanese forces held entrenched positions in jungle terrain and the only way to dislodge them was with indirect fire. Mortars. Artillery. Grenades lobbed over obstacles into positions you could not see. The problem, as Colby explained it to anyone who would listen, was that mortars required crews. 8 men to operate a 60mm M2 mortar effectively. 42 pounds of equipment. Excellent weapons, devastating when used correctly, but slow to reposition. In the Philippines, Colby had watched Japanese forces flank and overrun mortar positions because the crews could not displace fast enough under fire. Rifle grenades existed as an alternative. The M7 grenade launcher attached to the muzzle of an M1 Garand rifle and could send a grenade approximately 175 yards. But rifle grenades had fatal limitations. Maximum effective range of 100 yards. Required the rifleman to expose himself while attaching the grenade to the launcher. Inaccurate beyond 75 yards due to trajectory instability. Colby wanted something different. Something one man could operate. Something with the range of a mortar but the mobility of a rifle. Something that could deliver high explosive or white phosphorus grenades at 300 yards or more with enough accuracy to hit a Japanese bunker or trench line. He started sketching designs in December. Drawings on the back of ration box cardboard. Calculations scribbled in the margins of training manuals. Other men in his platoon spent their downtime playing cards or writing letters home. Colby spent his calculating barrel length and propellant ratios. On January 15, 1945, Colby approached Captain Raymond Morris with a formal request. Permission to use salvaged equipment to build a prototype grenade launcher. Permission to test the prototype at the division firing range. Permission to submit the design to Ordnance if testing proved successful. Captain Morris was 34 years old. West Point class of 1933. Career officer with a degree in military science and a fundamental distrust of enlisted men who thought they knew better than procurement officers in Washington. Morris listened to Colby's pitch for approximately 90 seconds before cutting him off. Sergeant, the United States Army employs thousands of engineers whose job is to design weapons. These engineers have advanced degrees from institutions like MIT and Carnegie Mellon. They have access to laboratories, testing facilities, and budgets that exceed the GDP of small nations. What makes you think you, with a high school education and a toolbox, can design something better than what those engineers have already produced? Colby's answer was simple. Sir, those engineers aren't getting shot at. I am. I know what works and what doesn't because I've seen men die when equipment fails. I'm not trying to design something better than what exists. I'm trying to design something for problems that existing equipment doesn't solve. Morris was unmoved. Sergeant, your job is to lead your squad and follow orders. Your job is not to invent weapons. Denied. Dismissed. Colby built it anyway. He scavenged materials from the division's salvage yard. A section of copper tubing from a damaged M2 flamethrower. The tubing was 18 inches long, 2 inches in diameter, rated for high-pressure propellant gases. Perfect for a grenade launcher barrel if you could solve the firing mechanism problem. The stock came from wooden planks used to build ammunition crates. Colby spent 2 nights in the maintenance tent with a handsaw and a wood file, shaping the planks into a shoulder stock and forearm grip. The design was simple. Functional. It looked like a rifle designed by someone who had never seen a rifle but understood the basic principles. The firing mechanism was the difficult part. Colby needed something that could ignite a propellant charge inside a sealed barrel without requiring complex machining. He found the solution in a damaged M1 Garand trigger assembly. The rifle had been destroyed by a Japanese grenade at Leyte, but the trigger mechanism was intact. Colby disassembled it, removed the firing pin and spring, and mounted the assembly beneath the launcher barrel using bolts salvaged from a truck engine. The propellant was the simplest part. Colby used standard 12-gauge shotgun powder, which was available in large quantities because the division had shotguns for close-quarters combat. Each shot required approximately 45 grains of powder, loaded into a cloth cartridge that Colby sewed by hand using medical gauze and thread from a field surgery kit. By January 24, 1945, the launcher was complete. Colby assembled it in secret, working in the maintenance tent after his squad was asleep. The final product weighed 11 pounds unloaded. The barrel could accept any standard Mark II fragmentation grenade, M15 white phosphorus grenade, or M9A1 high explosive grenade. Colby calculated theoretical range at 350 to 400 yards with a 20 to 25 degree elevation angle. Theoretical. Untested. Unproven. On January 26, Colby showed the launcher to his squad. 10 men, ages ranging from 19 to 37. Midwest farm boys, East Coast factory workers, one former college student from California who had enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. Men who had fought alongside Colby through Leyte and trusted his judgment, even when it contradicted orders. Private Eddie Marsh, 19 years old, from Iowa, looked at the launcher and said what everyone was thinking. "Sarge, that looks like something my dad would build to scare crows off the corn." Colby nodded. "Does it work, though? That's the question." Corporal Vincent Hayes, the squad's designated marksman, asked the important question. "You test it yet?" "No." "You planning to test it?" "Tomorrow morning. Before dawn. I need one volunteer to come with me and confirm I'm not insane." Private Marsh volunteered immediately. Not because he believed the launcher would work, but because he wanted to see what would happen when Colby fired it. The consensus among the squad was that the launcher would either explode in Colby's hands or send a grenade tumbling 30 yards before it hit the ground and failed to detonate. Either way, it would be worth watching. The battalion armorer, a staff sergeant named Kulik, refused to even look at the launcher when Colby brought it to the weapons shop. Kulik had spent 16 years in the Army and had seen too many soldiers blow off fingers or blind themselves with improvised equipment. He told Colby exactly what he thought. "Sergeant, I'm not testing that thing. I'm not inspecting it. I'm not signing any paperwork that says I looked at it and didn't confiscate it. If you fire that weapon and it explodes, I'm going to testify at your court-martial that I explicitly warned you against using improvised ordnance. Are we clear?" Colby assured him they were clear. Captain Morris never saw the launcher. Colby kept it disassembled and stored in a wooden crate beneath his bunk. When the company conducted equipment inspections, Colby listed the crate as personal effects. Nobody opened it. Nobody asked questions. The squad started calling it different names. Rube Goldberg's Revenge. The Sergeant's Science Project. The Junkyard Special. The name that stuck was simpler. The Junkyard Joke. Because that's what it looked like. A joke. A contraption built by someone with too much time and not enough sense. But on the morning of January 27, 1945, at a rice paddy 4 miles from Camp Tarawa, with only Private Marsh as a witness, Colby was about to find out if the joke would actually work. 0530 hours. January 27, 1945. The rice paddy had been abandoned since American forces secured the area in December. 6 acres of flooded terraces, now drained and overgrown with weeds. The nearest patrol route was 2 miles south. The nearest American position was 4 miles west at Camp Tarawa. Privacy. Isolation. The perfect place to test an unauthorized weapon without attracting attention from officers who would confiscate it. Colby and Private Marsh arrived on foot, carrying the launcher wrapped in canvas and a wooden crate containing 3 training grenades. Not live ordnance. Practice rounds filled with black powder that produced smoke but no fragmentation. Safer for testing. Less likely to attract attention if something went wrong. The target was a derelict Japanese supply cart, destroyed during the American advance in December. The cart sat at the northern edge of the rice paddy, 220 yards from Colby's position. Wooden frame. Intact wheels. Large enough to see clearly at distance. Small enough that hitting it would require accuracy. Colby assembled the launcher. The process took 40 seconds. Attach the barrel to the stock using hose clamps. Insert the trigger assembly. Load the propellant cartridge into the breech. Chamber the grenade. The Mark II fragmentation grenade weighed 21 ounces and fit snugly into the 2-inch barrel with approximately 1/8 inch of clearance on all sides. Private Marsh crouched 15 feet to Colby's left, behind a drainage berm that would provide cover if the launcher exploded. Marsh had brought a pair of binoculars and a notepad. His job was simple. Observe the impact. Record the distance. Confirm whether the grenade detonated on target or missed. Colby shouldered the launcher. The wooden stock pressed against his collarbone. The weight was front-heavy due to the copper barrel, but manageable. Colby had calculated a 22-degree elevation angle for 220 yards. He used a protractor and a length of string tied to the barrel to measure the angle. Crude, but functional. First shot. Colby squeezed the trigger. The firing pin struck the propellant cartridge. The black powder ignited with a dull whump. The grenade left the barrel traveling approximately 140 feet per second. The grenade landed 40 yards short of the target, struck the ground, tumbled twice, and detonated. A column of black smoke rose from the impact point. Private Marsh called out the distance. 180 yards, Sarge. You're short. Colby reloaded. He increased the propellant charge from 45 grains to 52 grains. More powder meant more velocity. More velocity meant greater range. The risk was overpressurizing the barrel and causing a catastrophic failure, but Colby had calculated that the copper tubing could handle up to 65 grains before structural failure became likely. Second shot. Same 22-degree angle. Increased propellant. Colby fired. This time the grenade arced higher, traveled farther, and overshot the target by 15 yards. The grenade landed in the weeds beyond the cart and detonated. Another column of smoke. Marsh's voice. 235 yards. You're long. Colby adjusted. Third grenade. Propellant charge reduced to 48 grains. Elevation angle reduced to 19 degrees. He had 3 variables to manage. Propellant charge. Elevation angle. The wind was negligible this morning, less than 5 miles per hour from the east. Colby compensated with a slight rightward aim adjustment. Third shot. The grenade launched with the same dull whump. It arced through the pre-dawn sky, descended, and struck the supply cart directly. The grenade detonated inside the wooden frame. The cart disintegrated in a cloud of black smoke and flying splinters. Private Marsh stood up from behind the berm. He lowered his binoculars and stared at Colby with an expression that mixed shock and disbelief. Holy shit, Sarge. It actually works. Colby did not respond immediately. He was already thinking about the next problem. The launcher worked, but the reload time was too slow. 40 seconds between shots. In combat, 40 seconds meant the enemy could advance 80 yards or more during a Banzai charge. 40 seconds meant the difference between breaking an assault and being overrun. Colby needed to reduce reload time. He needed to simplify the propellant loading process. He needed to create a system where a second man could load grenades while Colby aimed and fired, cutting the reload cycle in half. But that was a problem for later. Right now, at 05:53 hours on January 27, 1945, Colby had proven something that 6 weeks later would save the lives of 30 men in his company. He had proven that a Depression-era mechanic with a welding torch and a physics textbook could build a weapon that worked. Colby disassembled the launcher and packed it back into the wooden crate. He and Marsh walked back to Camp Tarawa in silence. When they reached the company area, Marsh asked the question that had been on his mind since the third shot. "You gonna show Captain Morris?" Colby shook his head. "Not yet. They'll laugh at us if it's just theory. They'll listen if it saves their asses. We wait for combat. We wait until there's no other choice." Marsh nodded. He understood the logic. Unauthorized equipment was one thing. Unauthorized equipment that worked was something else entirely. But proving it worked in a controlled test at a rice paddy was different from proving it worked under fire with lives on the line. They agreed to keep the test secret. No reports. No documentation. No mention to the other squad members. The launcher went back under Colby's bunk, stored in the wooden crate, waiting for the moment when improvisation would become necessity. That moment came 6 weeks later, on a ridgeline in Okinawa, when 200 Japanese soldiers charged across 380 yards of open ground, and the only thing standing between survival and slaughter was a junkyard joke that nobody believed would work. April 1, 1945. The 96th Infantry Division landed on Okinawa as part of Operation Iceberg, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War. 180,000 American troops. 1,500 ships. Air support from carriers offshore and B-29 bombers flying from captured bases in the Marianas. The objective was simple. Secure Okinawa. Establish airfields within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. Prepare for the invasion of Japan itself. The Japanese had 110,000 troops dug into the island. Fortified caves. Underground bunkers. Artillery positioned in limestone ridges that American naval guns could not reach. The Japanese strategy was not to stop the invasion. The strategy was to bleed the Americans. To make every yard cost lives. To create casualty rates so horrific that the American public would demand a negotiated peace rather than continue the slaughter. By March 15, the 96th Infantry Division had been fighting for 2 weeks. Progress was measured in yards, not miles. American casualties were mounting. 5,000 killed. 20,000 wounded. Malaria, dysentery, and combat fatigue were reducing effective combat strength faster than replacements could arrive. Staff Sergeant William Colby's company, K Company, 382nd Infantry Regiment, was positioned on the southern approach to Kakazu Ridge. The ridge was a limestone formation 600 yards long, 150 feet high, honeycombed with caves and tunnels. Japanese forces held the high ground. American forces held the low ground, a former sugarcane field that offered zero cover and perfect sightlines for Japanese observers. Intelligence reported that the Japanese 32nd Army was preparing a counteroffensive. Multiple Banzai charges across the American lines. Coordinated assaults designed to overrun positions before reinforcements could arrive. The tactic had worked at I.E. Shima, where Japanese forces had broken through American defenses and inflicted 800 casualties before being driven back. The 382nd Infantry Regiment expected the assault at dawn on March 15. Every indicator pointed to it. Increased Japanese radio traffic. Movement observed on the ridgeline. Civilians evacuating from villages north of the American positions. The kind of patterns that preceded every major Japanese attack for the past 2 weeks. K Company's defensive position was textbook. Machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Mortar crews pre-registered on approach routes. Rifle squads dug into foxholes with sandbag reinforcement. Captain Raymond Morris had positioned his men according to Doctrine. According to everything he had learned at West Point and in 3 years of combat. But Doctrine had a problem. A problem that Morris did not see but Colby calculated with cold precision on the night of March 14, while the rest of the company tried to sleep. The mortar crews were positioned 300 yards behind the front line. Standard doctrine. Mortars were crew-served weapons that required protection. Placing them too far forward meant risking overrun. Placing them 300 yards back meant they were safe but slow to respond. Colby did the math in his head. Banzai charges moved at approximately 8 to 10 yards per second. Sprinting soldiers, adrenaline-fueled, willing to die. The Japanese starting position on Kakazu Ridge was 600 yards from K Company's line. 600 yards at 8 yards per second meant 75 seconds from charge initiation to contact. Mortar response time was 4 to 5 minutes from the moment someone called for fire support to the moment the first rounds landed. 4 to 5 minutes. 240 to 300 seconds. The Japanese would overrun the American line, kill everyone in the foxholes, and be halfway back to their own positions before the first mortar rounds exploded. Rifle grenades had a maximum effective range of 100 yards. By the time Japanese soldiers reached 100 yards, they were 10 seconds from the American line. Not enough time to stop a coordinated charge. Not enough time to break the momentum. Colby explained this to his squad on the night of March 14 at 2200 hours, while they sat in their foxholes cleaning weapons and trying not to think about the assault that was coming in 6 hours. When they charge tomorrow, mortars won't respond fast enough. Rifle grenades won't reach far enough. We'll break the charge with rifles and machine guns, but it'll be close. Real close. Some of them will reach our line. Some of us won't be here tomorrow night. Private Marsh asked the question that everyone was thinking. What about your launcher, Sarge? Colby had brought the launcher to Okinawa. Packed in the same wooden crate. Stored beneath his bunk on the transport ship. Carried through 2 weeks of combat without ever assembling it. He had been waiting for the right moment. The moment when improvisation was not just useful but necessary. This was that moment. Colby retrieved the crate from his foxhole and assembled the launcher in front of his squad. 10 men watched in silence as Colby attached the copper barrel to the wooden stock, inserted the trigger assembly, and loaded a propellant cartridge into the breech. Corporal Hayes spoke first. You really gonna use that thing? Colby nodded. When they charge, I'm using it. If Captain Morris wants to court-martial me after, so be it. I'd rather be alive in the stockade than dead following Doctrine. Private Marsh grinned. I'll testify at your court-martial, Sarge. Tell them it was my idea. Tell them I forced you to do it. The rest of the squad laughed. Nervous laughter. The kind of laughter that came from men who knew they might die tomorrow and needed to find humor somewhere, anywhere, because the alternative was sitting in silence and waiting for dawn. Colby loaded 6 Mark II fragmentation grenades into a sandbag. 6 grenades. Enough for a sustained engagement if he could reload fast enough. He positioned the launcher next to his foxhole, within arm's reach, ready to deploy the moment Japanese soldiers appeared on the ridgeline. Captain Morris never saw the launcher that night. Morris was 200 yards away at the company command post, coordinating with battalion headquarters and reviewing defensive plans. He had no idea that one of his squad leaders was preparing to violate about a dozen regulations regarding unauthorized equipment and improvised ordnance. At 0400 hours, March 15th, Colby lay in his foxhole and watched the eastern sky begin to lighten. Dawn was 30 minutes away. The assault would come with first light. Japanese doctrine. Attack at dawn when visibility was poor and American forces were tired from a night of standing watch. Colby checked his launcher one final time. Barrel clear. Trigger mechanism functional. Propellant cartridge loaded. He had calculated a firing solution for targets at 350 to 400 yards. 22 degrees elevation. Minimal wind compensation. At 0423 hours, the sound began. Low at first. Distant voices from the ridgeline. Then building. Synchronized chanting in Japanese. The sound that American soldiers had learned to fear because it meant one thing. Banzai charge. Human wave assault. 200 men willing to die for the Emperor, charging across open ground with fixed bayonets, determined to kill as many Americans as possible before being cut down. Colby picked up his launcher and climbed out of his foxhole. He moved to the ruined stone wall 30 yards forward of the company line. Better firing position. Better sight line. He pressed his back against the rubble and waited. At 0429 hours, the first Japanese soldiers appeared on the ridgeline. Shadows at first. Then shapes. Then men. Hundreds of them. Assembling into formation. Officers at the front. Swords raised. The chanting grew louder. Colby estimated 200 to 250 soldiers. More than enough to overrun K Company if the charge was not broken in the first 30 seconds. At 0431 hours, the Japanese charged. The Japanese line surged forward like water breaking through a dam. Not a chaotic mob, but a coordinated assault. Officers leading from the front. Soldiers maintaining formation despite the distance. This was not desperation. This was doctrine. Practiced. Rehearsed. Executed hundreds of times across the Pacific at Saipan, Iwo Jima, Peleliu. The Banzai charge was a weapon. A psychological weapon designed to create panic in the defenders and shatter defensive lines through sheer momentum and shock. At 0431 hours, the Japanese were 600 yards from K Company's line. Colby could see them clearly now. Dark uniforms. Fixed bayonets catching the early light. The chanting was deafening. K Company opened fire. 50 M1 Garand rifles firing as fast as men could pull triggers. 2 Browning automatic rifles delivering suppressive fire at 500 rounds per minute. 2.30 caliber machine guns positioned on the flanks, firing interlocking lanes that created a wall of lead across the approach route. Effective range of the M1 Garand was 500 yards. The Japanese were 600 yards out. Too far for accurate rifle fire. But the machine guns could reach. Colby watched tracers arc across the sugarcane field and strike the Japanese line. Men fell. Soldiers stumbled. But the charge did not stop. At 0434 hours, the Japanese reached 400 yards. They were running now. Full sprint. Bayonets forward. Screaming. The sound cut through the gunfire like a blade. Primal. Terrifying. Designed to freeze the defender, to create hesitation, to exploit the split second when a man's brain chose between fight and flight. K Company kept firing. More Japanese soldiers fell. Colby estimated 20 to 30 casualties in the first 60 seconds. But 30 casualties out of 200 meant 170 soldiers still charging. Still closing the distance. Still coming. At 0435 hours, the mortar crews received the call for fire support. Radio transmission from Captain Morris at the command post to the mortar section 300 yards behind the line. Fire mission. Enemy assault. Coordinates North 573, East 289. Commence firing. The mortar crews acknowledged. Adjusting aim. First rounds in 3 minutes. 3 minutes. 180 seconds. The Japanese were 300 yards out and closing at 8 yards per second. They would reach K Company's line in 37 seconds. The mortars would fire their first rounds 143 seconds after the Japanese soldiers were already overrunning the foxholes. At 0436 hours, a private in 3rd Squad abandoned his position. Colby saw him out of the corner of his eye. A kid, maybe 20 years old, climbing out of his foxhole and running toward the rear. Panic. The infectious kind. One man running could create a cascade. Others would follow. The line would collapse not because of enemy fire but because of fear. Corporal Hayes saw it too. Hayes grabbed the kid by his webbing and threw him back into the foxhole. Hayes screamed something Colby could not hear over the gunfire, but the message was clear. Fight. Die in your hole if you have to, but do not run. The kid stayed. At 0437 hours, the Japanese were 250 yards out. Close enough that Colby could see individual faces. Young men. Older men. Expressions of determination and rage and something that looked like acceptance. They knew most of them would die. They charged anyway. This was the moment. The moment when Colby's improvised launcher would either prove itself or prove the doubters right. The moment when a junkyard joke built from copper tubing and salvaged rifle parts would either break a 200-man assault or fail spectacularly and condemn Colby's company to a close-quarters fight they had no chance of winning. Colby picked up the launcher. He had already loaded a grenade. M15 white phosphorus. Willie Pete. Chemical incendiary that burned at 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit and could not be extinguished with water. Colby had chosen white phosphorus for the first shot deliberately. Not because he wanted to cause maximum suffering, but because white phosphorus created psychological effects that high-explosive rounds did not. Men who saw their comrades burning alive often broke formation, often stopped charging, often chose survival over orders. Captain Morris was 40 feet to Colby's left, crouched behind the same ruined stone wall. Morris saw the launcher in Colby's hands. Saw the copper barrel. The wooden stock. The contraption that looked like something assembled in a garage. Morris shouted over the gunfire. "Sergeant, what the hell is that?" Colby did not look at him. He was sighting down the barrel, calculating wind, calculating elevation, calculating where the Japanese officers would be in the 3 seconds it would take the grenade to reach them. "Sir, respectfully watch." Colby aimed not at the charging line, but at the rear. At the officers. The Japanese soldiers 380 yards out, directing the assault with swords and commands. Kill the officers, break the command structure, create confusion in the ranks. Colby adjusted the elevation to 22 degrees. He controlled his breathing. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The same breathing discipline he used at the rifle range. The same breathing discipline that had won him expert marksman qualification in 1943. He squeezed the trigger. The propellant charge ignited with a dull whump. The grenade left the barrel at 140 feet per second. It arced into the dawn sky, tumbling slightly due to wind, climbing to an apex of approximately 60 feet before descending toward the Japanese command group. Flight time, 3 seconds. The white phosphorus grenade struck the ground 12 feet from the Japanese command group. 3 officers. Swords raised. Voices shouting commands. The grenade detonated on impact. White phosphorus explosive scattered burning chemical in a 35-yard radius. The effect was instantaneous. Officers engulfed in flames. Screaming. Thrashing. Trying to extinguish fires that could not be extinguished. White phosphorus burned through fabric, through skin, through muscle. It burned until the chemical was consumed or the victim was dead. There was no third option. The Japanese soldiers in the front ranks of the charge stopped running. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough. 50 men out of 200 hesitated for a split second. Turned to look at the burning officers behind them. Lost momentum. Lost formation. That hesitation was all Colby needed. He worked the bolt on his launcher. 8 seconds. Too slow. He needed to cut reload time in half. Private Marsh was at his side now, emerging from his foxhole with a sandbag full of grenades. Marsh handed Colby the next round. M9A1 high-explosive fragmentation. Marsh had already loaded the propellant cartridge into the breech. All Colby had to do was chamber the grenade, aim, fire. Reload time, 4 seconds. The Japanese charge had slowed but not stopped. The soldiers in the front ranks resumed running. They were 200 yards from K Company's line now. 15 seconds from contact. Colby aimed at the center of the formation. Dense cluster of soldiers. Maximum casualties per grenade. He fired. The high-explosive grenade arced through the air and landed in the center of the Japanese line. Detonation. 15-yard kill radius. Fragmentation spread in a circular pattern. Soldiers fell. Others stumbled over the bodies. The charge faltered. Colby reloaded. Third grenade. Another round. He targeted the left flank of the assault. The Japanese soldiers attempting to swing wide and flank K Company's machine gun position. If that flank succeeded, the machine guns would be overrun and the defensive line would collapse. He fired. Detonation. The left flank dissolved. 8 soldiers killed outright. 15 to 20 wounded. The survivors broke formation and dove into the sugarcane for cover. But there was no cover. The field had been harvested months ago. The sugarcane was ankle-high stubble. Men lying in stubble with American machine guns firing directly at them had a life expectancy measured in seconds. The Japanese assault was no longer a coordinated charge. It was a disintegrating mob. Some soldiers still running forward. Others retreating. Others lying in the field wounded or dead. Officers were gone. Command structure was gone. The psychological momentum that made Banzai charges effective was gone. At 04:37 hours and 50 seconds, the assault broke. Japanese soldiers who had been charging with fixed bayonets 20 seconds ago were now running in the opposite direction. Back toward the ridgeline. Back toward the caves and bunkers where they could regroup. The American machine guns cut them down as they fled. Rifle fire from K Company picked off stragglers. The mortar crews, who had spent 4 minutes adjusting their aim, finally fired their first rounds. The mortars landed among retreating Japanese soldiers 300 yards from the American line. Colby loaded a 4th grenade. He targeted a group of Japanese soldiers attempting to rally at the 300-yard line. Approximately 20 men. Trying to form a defensive position to cover the retreat. Colby fired. The grenade landed among them. Detonation. The defensive position ceased to exist. Colby loaded a 5th grenade. He scanned the field for targets. Most of the Japanese force was either dead, wounded, or retreating beyond effective range. But there was one cluster of soldiers at the 350-yard line. 15 men. Dug into a shallow depression. Firing at K Company with rifles. Pinning down the American left flank. Colby aimed carefully. Maximum range for his launcher. He adjusted elevation to 24 degrees. Fired. The grenade arced high, almost vertical at the apex, then descended. It landed directly in the depression. Detonation. The rifle fire from that position stopped. At 04:38 hours and 42 seconds, the assault was over. 200 Japanese soldiers had charged across 600 yards of open ground. An assault that should have overrun K Company's position and killed everyone in the foxholes. An assault that had succeeded at Ieshima, at Kakazu West, at a dozen other positions in the past 2 weeks. Time from Colby's first grenade to complete collapse of the assault. 1 minute, 22 seconds. Captain Morris stood up from behind the stone wall. He stared at Colby. Then, at the launcher. Then at the battlefield where Japanese bodies lay in clusters marking each grenade impact. Morris walked over to Colby. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Sergeant, what the hell was that thing?" Colby ejected the spent propellant cartridge from his launcher. His hands were steady. No adrenaline shake. No tremor. He had just broken a 200-man assault with 5 grenades, and he was as calm as if he had been target shooting at Camp Tarawa. "Sir, it's an improvised grenade launcher. Built from salvaged materials. Copper tubing. With stock. Modified rifle trigger. Effective range 300 to 400 yards. I tested it once in January. It worked. Figured it might work again today." Morris did not respond immediately. He was processing, trying to reconcile the fact that an enlisted mechanic with a garage education had built a weapon that just saved 30 lives and possibly prevented a breakthrough in the American defensive line. Finally, Morris asked the only question that mattered. "Can you make more?" 0500 hours. March 15, 1945. The sun was fully above the horizon now. The battlefield was visible in daylight. Japanese bodies scattered across the sugarcane field. Some killed by rifle fire. Some by machine gun fire. But the clusters, the dense concentrations of casualties at specific points, those were from Colby's grenades. K Company conducted a casualty count. 3 Americans wounded by rifle fire during the assault. 0 killed. The defensive line had held. Not because of doctrine. Not because of superior firepower. But because a staff sergeant with an improvised launcher had broken the assault's momentum in the first 90 seconds. Captain Morris assembled his platoon leaders at the command post. 4 officers. Ages ranging from 24 to 36. West Point graduates and officer candidate school promotions. Men who had been trained to follow doctrine and trust that doctrine worked. Morris pointed at Colby's launcher, which was leaning against the stone wall where Colby had left it. "That weapon just saved this company. I want to know everything about it. Materials. Construction time. Effective range. Accuracy. Rate of fire. Everything." Colby explained. Copper tubing from a damaged flamethrower. Wooden stock from ammunition crate planks. Modified M1 Garand trigger assembly. Propellant charges hand-loaded using shotgun powder and medical gauze. Total construction time, approximately 12 hours spread over 6 nights. Effective range, 300 to 400 yards depending on elevation angle and propellant charge. Accuracy, sufficient to hit a man-sized target at 200 yards, sufficient to hit a 10-yard radius at 350 yards. Rate of fire, 1 round every 4 seconds with a trained loader. One of the platoon leaders, a second lieutenant named Carr, asked the question that Morris had been thinking since the assault ended. "Can we build more?" Colby nodded. "Sir, if I have materials and help, I can build 10 launchers in 72 hours. Maybe more if we have enough copper tubing and functioning trigger assemblies." Morris made a decision. Not the kind of decision covered in field manuals or taught at West Point. The kind of decision that came from watching men die for 2 weeks and realizing that doctrine was not always enough. "Sergeant, you're off the line. As of right now, you're attached to battalion engineering. You will build as many of these launchers as materials allow. You will train operators. You will develop firing doctrine. You have authority to requisition any materials you need from any source. If someone refuses, you send them to me." Colby hesitated. "Sir, I'd rather stay with my squad." Morris understood. Squad leaders did not want to leave their men. Especially not men they had been fighting alongside for 8 months. But Morris also understood that Colby's value to the battalion had just increased exponentially. Colby alive and building launchers was worth more than Colby dead in a foxhole. "Sergeant, your squad needs you alive. The battalion needs those launchers." "That's an order." At 0615 hours, the battalion commander arrived at K Company's position. Colonel Arthur Wade. Age 47. Career officer with 2 Bronze Stars and a reputation for aggressive tactics. Wade had been monitoring radio traffic during the assault. He knew a Banzai charge had been broken with minimal American casualties. He did not know how. Captain Morris briefed the colonel. Explained Colby's launcher. Showed him the weapon. Took him to the battlefield and pointed out the grenade impact craters. Colonel Wade was silent for approximately 30 seconds. Then he turned to Colby. Effective range? 300 to 400 yards, sir. Rate of fire? 1 round every 4 seconds with a trained loader, sir. Materials required for construction? Copper tubing, wood, rifle trigger assemblies, and basic hand tools, sir. How many can you build? As many as materials allow, sir. Estimate 10 launchers within 72 hours if I have help and access to salvage yards. Wade made his decision. Sergeant, you're now assigned to battalion headquarters. I'm authorizing you to recruit 6 engineers and 12 infantry volunteers. You will establish a workshop at the rear area maintenance depot. You will build 20 launchers. You will train 40 men to operate them. You will develop firing tables for different ranges and grenade types. You have 72 hours. After that, I want these launchers distributed across the regiment. Colby saluted. Yes, sir. But before Colby could leave, Private Marsh stepped forward. Marsh had been standing 20 feet away, listening to the conversation. He spoke directly to the colonel, which violated about a dozen rules regarding enlisted men addressing senior officers, but Marsh did it anyway. Sir, request permission to assist Sergeant Colby. I helped him test the launcher in January. I know how it works. He'll need loaders and I'm already trained. Colonel Wade looked at Captain Morris. Morris nodded. Wade turned back to Marsh. Permission granted, Private. You're reassigned with Sergeant Colby. As Wade walked away to inspect the battlefield, Morris pulled Colby aside. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. Sergeant, back in January when you asked to build this thing, I called it a waste of time. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Colby did not need the apology. He understood why Morris had refused. Officers were taught to trust Doctrine, to trust the engineers in Washington, to trust that the equipment provided was sufficient. Colby had never trusted any of that. He trusted what he could build with his own hands and test with his own eyes. Sir, you made the right call based on what you knew. I made the right call based on what I saw in the Philippines. We're both still alive. That's what matters. Morris extended his hand. Colby shook it. At 0700 hours, Colby and Marsh gathered their gear and walked to the rear area maintenance depot. Colby carried his launcher. Marsh carried the sandbag of unused grenades. They had 72 hours to build an arsenal that would change how the 96th Infantry Division fought for the rest of the Okinawa campaign. Behind them, K Company resumed defensive positions. The battlefield was being cleared. Japanese bodies were being collected. The stone wall where Colby had fired his first shot was already being reinforced with sandbags. And in a wooden crate beneath Colby's former bunk, stored among his personal effects, was a water-stained copy of a 1938 Popular Mechanics magazine. The magazine that had taught a Depression-era mechanic how to calculate trajectory and propellant charges. The magazine that, in a strange and indirect way, had just saved 30 American lives. March 16 through March 18, 1945. The rear area maintenance depot was a collection of tents and salvage yards located 2 miles behind the front line. Far enough from combat that mortar fire was unlikely. Close enough that supplies could reach the line in under an hour. The depot handled vehicle repairs, weapons maintenance, and equipment salvage from destroyed units. Colby set up his workshop in a canvas tent originally used for Jeep maintenance. The tent was 40 feet long, 20 feet wide, with wooden workbenches and tool racks salvaged from the division's pre-invasion supply dump. Colby's team consisted of 6 engineers from the 321st Engineer Battalion, 4 welders from the motor pool, and 12 infantry volunteers who had been rotated off the line for rest. 22 men. 72 hours. 20 launchers. The first problem was materials. Colby needed copper tubing for the barrels. 18 inches in length, 2 inches in diameter, rated for high-pressure gases. The division had 8 damaged M2 flamethrowers in the salvage yard. Each flamethrower had approximately 4 feet of copper tubing suitable for launcher barrels. 8 flamethrowers meant 32 feet of tubing. Enough for 21 barrels if Colby cut carefully. But flamethrower tubing was scarce. Colby could build 21 launchers, but what about the next batch? What about the 30 launchers Colonel Wade wanted after the first 20 were complete? Colby needed an alternative material source. He found it in Okinawan farms. Before the invasion, Okinawa had been heavily agricultural. Rice paddies, sugarcane fields, vegetable farms. Many of those farms had irrigation systems built from aluminum pipe. The pipes were lighter than copper, which meant they required internal reinforcement to handle propellant pressure, but they were abundant. Colby sent 2 engineers and 4 infantry volunteers to scout farms within 3 miles of the depot. They returned with 180 feet of aluminum pipe. Reinforcement was simple. Colby wrapped the aluminum barrels with wire salvaged from radio antennas. 3 layers of wire, tightly wound, increased the pressure tolerance enough that the aluminum could handle a 50-grain propellant charge without catastrophic failure. The second problem was standardization. Colby's original launcher had been built by hand, with measurements eyeballed and components fitted through trial and error. That worked for 1 weapon, but it did not work for 20. Each launcher needed identical barrel length, identical elevation mechanisms, identical trigger assemblies. Otherwise, firing tables would be useless. A launcher with a 19-inch barrel would have different trajectory characteristics than a launcher with a 17-inch barrel. Colby solved the problem with measurement jigs. He built wooden templates that standardized barrel length, stock dimensions, and trigger mounting positions. Every launcher was built using the same templates. Every barrel was cut to exactly 18 inches. Every stock was shaped to exactly 48 inches. Every trigger assembly was mounted at exactly the same position relative to the barrel. By March 17th, the workshop had completed 8 launchers. Colby tested each one at a makeshift range 400 yards behind the depot. He fired 3 grenades per launcher. Checked for accuracy. Checked for structural integrity. Checked that the propellant charges produced consistent velocity. 7 launchers passed testing. 1 failed. The barrel split during the second shot due to a defect in the aluminum pipe. Colby disassembled the failed launcher and salvaged the components for spares. The third problem was training. Colby had 40 men designated as launcher operators. Most of them had never fired a grenade launcher of any kind. Most had never calculated trajectory or adjusted elevation for range. Colby needed to teach them skills that typically required weeks of mortar training, and he had 48 hours. Colby simplified the training. He created range cards. Laminated paper sheets with pre-calculated elevation angles for every 50-yard increment from 100 to 400 yards. Operators did not need to understand trigonometry. They needed to estimate range, find the corresponding elevation on the range card, and adjust the launcher accordingly. Training began on March 17th. Colby divided the 40 operators into 2-man teams. Shooter and loader. The shooter aimed and fired. The loader handled propellant cartridges and grenades. Each team practiced at the range until they could fire 1 round every 5 seconds and hit a man-sized target at 200 yards. By March 18th, 24 men had qualified as proficient operators. The remaining 16 required additional training. Colby extended their training by 1 day. On March 18th, Colby introduced an innovation that would increase the launcher's effectiveness beyond what he had originally calculated. He added an adjustable bipod salvaged from a .30 caliber Browning machine gun. The bipod attached to the barrel with hose clamps and provided stability during aiming. It also allowed the operator to adjust elevation without moving the entire launcher, which reduced time between shots. Additionally, Colby designed a quick-release mount system. The launcher could be detached from its bipod in under 3 seconds and repositioned to a new location. This was critical in combat. Japanese forces had learned to target American machine gun nests and mortar positions with counter-battery fire. A launcher that could fire 3 grenades and then relocate in under 10 seconds was harder to target than a static position. Rate of fire improved from 1 round every 8 seconds to 1 round every 5 seconds. Colby's original test in January had produced a reload time of 8 seconds. Through iterative improvements, better training, and streamlined propellant loading, the reload time had been cut by 37%. On March 19th, at 1400 hours, Colby completed the 20th launcher. The workshop had exceeded Colonel Wade's quota. 20 launchers built in 72 hours. 40 men trained. 180 grenades stockpiled from battalion supply. Firing tables created for Mark II fragmentation grenades, M15 white phosphorus grenades, and M9A1 high-explosive grenades. Colonel Wade inspected the launchers personally. He fired one himself at the test range. 3 shots. 3 hits at 250 yards. Wade was impressed. Not just with the weapon, but with Colby's ability to scale production and training in under a week. Wade issued orders. The 20 launchers would be distributed to 3 companies in the regiment. K Company, which had already seen the launcher in action, would receive 6. L Company and M Company would each receive 7. Instructions were simple: use the launchers in the next defensive engagement. Report effectiveness. Report failures. Report any improvements that could be made. On March 20th at 0400 hours, Japanese forces launched another Banzai charge. This time against L Company, positioned 2 miles west of K Company sector. 250 Japanese soldiers. Same tactics as before. Dawn assault. Fixed bayonets. Officers leading with swords. L Company had 2 of Colby's launchers. The operators had been trained for less than 48 hours. They had never fired the launchers in combat. At 0406 hours, the launchers opened fire. 6 grenades in 30 seconds. The Japanese assault broke. 90 seconds from charge initiation to complete collapse. 0 American casualties. On March 21st, Colonel Wade issued new orders. Expand production. 30 additional launchers. Train 60 more operators. Establish launcher sections in every company in the regiment. And on March 21st, at 1600 hours, Staff Sergeant William Colby was promoted to Technical Sergeant. Not because of his combat record, though that was exemplary. Not because of his leadership, though his squad respected him more than any officer they had served under. Colby was promoted because he had done something the United States Army desperately needed. He had innovated under fire. He had identified a tactical gap and filled it with improvisation, ingenuity, and a willingness to ignore doctrine when doctrine was insufficient. From March 22nd through April 15th, Colby's workshop produced 47 additional launchers. 67 total. Distributed across the 96th Infantry Division. Used in 18 separate defensive engagements. Estimated 300 Japanese casualties directly attributable to launcher fire. American casualty rates in launcher-equipped units were 40% lower than non-equipped units. But Colby never saw the full impact of his invention. On April 18th, he was transferred stateside. Orders from Pacific Command. The Ordnance Corps wanted to interview him about the launchers. Wanted technical specifications. Wanted to determine if the improvised design could be standardized and mass-produced. Colby left Okinawa on April 20, 1945. He packed his original launcher in a wooden crate and took it with him. The launcher that had broken a 200-man assault in 82 seconds. The launcher that had been mocked as a junkyard joke. The launcher that, in a small but significant way, changed how the United States Army thought about improvised ordnance and the value of soldier-driven innovation. April 1945 through June 1945. While William Colby traveled stateside for his Ordnance Corps interview, the war in the Pacific continued. Okinawa was declared secure on June 21, 1945, but the cost had been staggering. 12,000 American deaths. 38,000 wounded. 110,000 Japanese military deaths. Estimated 100,000 Okinawan civilian deaths. The bloodiest battle in the Pacific War. A preview of what the invasion of mainland Japan would cost if the war continued. Colby's launchers remained in service through the end of the campaign. 67 launchers distributed across the 96th Infantry Division. Used in defensive and offensive operations. Used to suppress Japanese bunkers, break up counterattacks, and provide indirect fire support when mortars were unavailable or too slow to respond. After-action reports from company commanders consistently noted the effectiveness of the improvised launchers. One report from K Company stated, The grenade launcher developed by T/SGT Colby has proven invaluable in breaking enemy assaults and suppressing enemy positions at ranges beyond rifle grenade capability. Recommends standardization and distribution to all infantry regiments. But standardization never happened. The Ordnance Corps reviewed Colby's design in May 1945. Engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground tested captured launchers. They confirmed the design worked. They confirmed it was effective. But they also noted that the M20 Super Bazooka was already in the final stages of development. The M20 was a purpose-built weapon with standardized components, factory production, and logistics support. The Army did not need an improvised grenade launcher when a standardized weapon would be available within months. However, the Ordnance Corps did incorporate one of Colby's innovations into the M20 design. The quick reload mechanism that allowed propellant cartridges to be loaded without disassembling the weapon. Colby's design used a breech loading system that reduced reload time by 40% compared to existing launchers. That system, refined and standardized, became part of the M20 specification. Colby never received credit for the contribution. The Ordnance Corps classified his design as expedient field modification and filed the technical drawings in their archive. Colby's name appeared in internal memos and after-action reports, but not in official weapon development documentation. In July 1945, Colby was assigned to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. His job was weapons testing, evaluating captured Japanese equipment, providing feedback on new American designs. It was quiet work, safe work, the kind of assignment given to soldiers the Army wanted to keep alive because they had knowledge worth preserving. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 ended the war before Colby could return to combat. Japan surrendered on August 15. The invasion of mainland Japan was cancelled. The war that had consumed 6 years and 70 million lives was over. Colby was discharged from the Army in January 1946. He returned to Decatur, Illinois, and reopened his auto repair shop. He married in 1947. Had 3 children, lived a quiet life. He never patented his grenade launcher design. When asked why, he said the design belonged to the Army. He had built it using Army materials, tested it on Army time, and used it to save Army lives. Patenting it would have felt like theft. But Colby's design did not disappear. Veterans who had used the launchers on Okinawa remembered them. Some of those veterans served in Korea when that war began in 1950. And in Korea, similar improvised launchers started appearing in field reports. Soldiers building weapons from salvaged materials using Colby's principles. Not because the Army had taught them, but because veterans had shared the knowledge informally. Barracks conversations. Training anecdotes. The oral tradition of soldiers teaching soldiers. One launcher, allegedly built in Korea using Colby's 1945 specifications, is on display at Camp Pendleton Marine Corps Museum in California. The placard describes it as improvised grenade launcher, circa 1950, origin unknown. In 1961, the United States Army adopted the M79 grenade launcher as standard infantry equipment. The M79 was a purpose-built, single-shot weapon designed for one-man operation. Effective range, 400 yards. Rate of fire, 6 to 8 rounds per minute. The M79 became iconic during the Vietnam War, used by thousands of soldiers in hundreds of thousands of engagements. The M79's design philosophy, lightweight, single operator, rapid fire, 400-yard range, was nearly identical to Colby's improvised launcher from 1945. The Army had spent 16 years and millions of dollars developing a weapon that a mechanic from Illinois had built in a maintenance tent using salvaged copper tubing and a physics textbook. In 1982, a reporter from the Decatur Herald interviewed William Colby for a story about local World War II veterans. Colby was 66 years old, retired, still living in the same house he had bought in 1947. The reporter asked if Colby felt bitter that the Army had never officially recognized his invention. Colby's answer was simple. People ask me if I'm angry the Army never gave me credit. I tell them I don't care about credit. I care that boys went home to their mothers. That's the only medal that matters. William Colby died in 1998, age 82. He was buried with military honors at Graceland Cemetery in Decatur. His obituary mentioned his service in the Philippines and Okinawa but did not mention the grenade launcher. Most people at his funeral did not know he had invented anything. They knew him as a mechanic, a father, a quiet man who never talked much about the war. One of Colby's original launchers survived. It was donated to the Okinawa Prefectural Peace Memorial Museum in 1989 by a veteran who had served in K Company, 382nd Infantry Regiment. The launcher sits in a glass display case on the second floor. The placard reads, Improvised American Grenade Launcher, 1945. Inventor unknown. The museum receives approximately 400,000 visitors per year. Most of them walk past the launcher without stopping. It looks like scrap metal welded to a plank. Crude. Unremarkable. They do not know that the weapon in the case broke a 200-man Banzai charge in 82 seconds. They do not know it saved 30 American lives in a single engagement. They do not know the man who built it died without recognition, without bitterness, satisfied that he had done what mattered. William Colby's grenade launcher was never officially recognized by the United States Army. Never given a military designation. Never included in field manuals or procurement documents. But on the morning of March 15, 1945, when 200 Japanese soldiers charged across 600 yards of Okinawan sugarcane field, it was the only thing standing between survival and slaughter. William Colby's improvised grenade launcher was never officially recognized. Never given a military designation. Never included in weapons manuals. But on the morning of March 15, 1945, when 200 Japanese soldiers charged across 600 yards of Okinawan sugarcane field, it was the only thing standing between survival and slaughter. The improvised grenade launcher proved something the Army did not want to admit. That sometimes a mechanic with a welding torch and a physics textbook knows more than the procurement officers in Washington. That sometimes innovation comes from the foxhole, not the laboratory. That sometimes the men fighting the war understand the problems better than the men planning it. Colby built his launcher because Doctrine was insufficient. Because mortars were too slow and rifle grenades were too short-ranged and men were dying while waiting for solutions that should have existed years earlier. He built it because he had the skills, the materials, and the willingness to ignore regulations when regulations were killing people. The United States Army eventually learned what Colby knew in 1945. That infantry needed lightweight, rapid-fire, long-range grenade launchers. The M79, adopted 16 years after Colby's improvised version proved the concept, became one of the most effective weapons of the Vietnam War. But the Army's version came too late for the men who fought on Okinawa. Too late for the soldiers who could have used Colby's design at Iwo Jima, at Peleliu, at Saipan. Today, one launcher sits in a museum in Okinawa. Most visitors walk past it. It looks like scrap metal welded to a plank. They do not know it broke a Banzai charge in 82 seconds. They do not know it saved dozens of American lives. They do not know the man who built it died without recognition. They do not know his name is not on the placard because the museum does not have that information. Because the Army never formally documented who built it. Because William Colby's contribution to military innovation was filed away in archives that nobody reads and forgotten by institutions that should have remembered. If this story moved you, if you believe William Colby deserves to be remembered, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten heroes from the archives every single day. Stories about mechanics who became innovators. Stories about soldiers who solved problems with ingenuity instead of firepower. Stories about men who refused to accept that Doctrine was sufficient when Doctrine was getting people killed. Drop a comment and tell us where you are watching from. United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Japan? Our community stretches across the world, and you are not just a viewer. You are a curator of history. You are part of making sure that men like William Colby do not disappear into footnotes. If someone in your family served, tell us their name. Tell us their story. These men and women deserve more than silence. They deserve more than a museum placard that says, "Inventor Unknown." They deserve to be remembered by name, with specificity, with the kind of detail that makes them real instead of abstract. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for making sure William Colby does not disappear into the archives. Thank you for being part of a community that believes forgotten heroes deserve to be found.